I was 51 years old the November I rode into Cutter's Fork to post a notice at the land office, and I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I was not a man who was looking. I had not been looking for 7 years. After Alina died, the fever took her in the spring of 1872 before we'd managed even 2 full years on the Morrow's Reach spread. I had made a decision, the way a man makes a decision when the grief is too big to carry and too heavy to put down. I decided I was done. Not done living exactly. Done with the part of living that required you to need somebody. I had the cattle. I had the land. I had a good horse and a sound roof, and enough years of army scouting behind me that I knew how to be alone without going to pieces over it. I was fine. 7 years of fine. Then the county land grant office sent me a letter. The short version. The Territorial Land Act of 1874 required that grant holders above a certain acreage demonstrate what they called settled family establishment on the property by December 31st of the grant's 5th renewal year, or forfeit the grant to the territory for redistribution. My 5th renewal year was 1879. My deadline was 6 weeks away. I had 4,200 acres, 1,100 head of cattle, and no family establishment of any kind, settled or otherwise. My ranch foreman, a patient man named Dub Kelso, had brought me the letter in September and watched me read it twice and set it down on the table and go back out to work, and he had let me do that for 2 weeks before he said anything. "You know what settled family establishment means," he said one evening. "I know what it means. And I'm thinking about it." "You've been thinking about it for 2 weeks." "I'm a slow thinker." Dub was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a widow woman in Cutter's Fork. Sutton, I think the name is. Her husband died in the spring fever, same as—" He stopped. "Her farm is about 400 acres east side of the Dellard. She's been working it alone since April. Word is she won't make it through the winter without help." I didn't say anything. "I'm not suggesting anything," Dub said. "Just telling you what I know." "I know what you're suggesting," I said. He got up and poured himself more coffee and didn't push it, and I sat with the letter on the table in front of me for another week before I rode into Cutter's Fork to post the notice. The notice was plain. I was not a man for ornamentation. Rancher 51, established spread, seeks wife for practical arrangement. Terms fair and clearly stated. Respond to C. Morrow, Morrow's Reach, Dellard River Road, or present yourself at the Cutter's Fork Land Office, Tuesdays before noon. I posted it on a Tuesday and sat in the land office and waited, feeling like a man who had done something he wasn't sure he could explain. And by 11 o'clock, nobody had come in, and I had nearly talked myself into riding home and writing to the county about an extension when the door opened. She was not what I expected. I'm not sure what I expected, something more visibly desperate maybe, or at least visibly something. Vera Sutton looked like a woman who had come to a business meeting. She was perhaps 38, with dark hair going silver at the temples, put up practically under a plain wool hat. Her coat was good quality but old. Her boots were well maintained. She had a set of papers under her arm, her farm deed as it turned out. She'd brought documentation, and she sat down across from me and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as professional. "You're Morrow," she said. "Yes." "I'm Vera Sutton." She set the papers on the table between us. "I read your notice. I have some questions before I decide whether this is worth either of our time." I had not anticipated questions. "Go ahead," I said. She had 6 of them. They were what exactly the terms of the arrangement were, whether I expected a wife to also serve as household labor, or whether I employed staff for that, what happened to her farm's 400 acres if she agreed to the arrangement, whether there was a written contract or only a verbal understanding, how long the arrangement needed to last to satisfy the land grant requirement. And this one she asked last, in the same even tone as the others. what I intended to do at the end of the required period, if the arrangement proved unworkable for either party. I answered them all. My answers were, the arrangement was a legal marriage with mutual respect and a fair share of the ranch's proceeds. I had a foreman and a cook, and she would not be expected to serve as either. Her farm would be held in her name under a separate deed, and she could return to it if the arrangement ended. There would be a written contract with every term stated plainly. The land grant requirement was 1 calendar year. And if the arrangement proved unworkable, we would agree to a legal separation, and she would leave with everything she'd come with, and a fair year's compensation besides. She listened to all of this without writing anything down. Then she said, "One more question." "All right. Why haven't you married again in 7 years?" I looked at her. She looked back at me, not unkindly but completely direct. "Because I didn't want to," I said. "And now?" "Now I have a deadline," I said. She considered that for a moment. Then she said, "I'll need 3 days to think about it." She took 3 days. On the 4th day she came back and said she'd accept the terms. We signed the contract with the land agent as witness, and we were married by Pastor Helm at the Cutter's Fork Church on a Thursday morning in November with Dub Kelso and me Gruder from the Dry Goods as witnesses. And by noon, we were on the road back to Morrow's Reach in the wagon with her trunk in the back and a cold wind coming out of the north. And I think we said perhaps 15 words to each other the whole ride home. That was how it started. And I want to be honest about something. I thought I knew exactly what was going to happen. I thought we were going to live in the same house for 12 months, conduct ourselves with mutual respect, satisfy the county's requirement, and then assess at the end of the year whether to continue or conclude. Businesslike, orderly, the way I ran everything. I was wrong about that. I was wrong in ways that took me most of the winter to understand, and a few more months after that to admit. The first 2 weeks were careful. Morrow's Reach was a working ranch, not elaborate but solid. A main house with 4 rooms, a bunkhouse for the hands, a cookhouse where a man named Petties ran the meals, a barn that I'd rebuilt from the foundation up the year after Alina died because I'd needed something big to do. Vera moved into the 2nd bedroom and put her things away with the same methodical efficiency she'd brought to the land office. And by the end of the first day, she had assessed the house in a way I recognized without being able to name. The way a capable person walks through a new space and catalogs what works and what doesn't. She didn't say much about it. She made one comment on the 2nd morning about the kitchen window hinge being broken in a way that let the cold in, and I said I'd fix it, and I did that afternoon, and when she came into the kitchen and saw it done she just nodded and went on with what she was doing. That was the register we operated in those first weeks. A nod here, a plain sentence there, pass the salt. I'll be out at the east fence line. Petty says there's a storm coming Thursday. Dub watched all of this from a careful distance and kept his opinions to himself, which was one of his better qualities. The thing I noticed first in those early weeks was that Vera did not perform. I had expected, I'm not sure what I'd expected. Some version of a woman trying to demonstrate her usefulness, or alternately, some version of a woman waiting to be told what to do. Vera was neither. She simply identified things that needed doing and did them, in the same quiet way she'd breathed or walked. The broken window hinge. A section of fence on the south side of the kitchen garden that the wind had been at. A set of account ledgers I'd been keeping in a system that worked but was, as she put it, a creative approach to numbers. She reorganized the ledgers in an afternoon and showed me the new system without commentary, and I used it because it was better than mine. She didn't ask permission for any of it. She also didn't claim territory she wasn't entitled to. She stayed out of the operations of the ranch itself, the cattle and the hands and the feed rotation, which were mine, and I stayed out of the house, which became, quietly and without negotiation, hers. A fair division. The kind that happens when 2 competent people share a space and have enough respect for each other not to bump up against the other's edges. I thought, this is workable. This is orderly. This is exactly what I said it would be. I thought that for about 3 weeks. The thing that undid me the first time was something small. It was a Wednesday evening in late November, cold enough that the hands had come in early, and Vera was at the kitchen table with one of the ledgers, and I was by the stove reading a letter from the county assessor, and Petties had left a pot of coffee on the stove before he went to the cookhouse, and I stood up to pour a cup, and the handle of the pot was loose. I'd been meaning to fix it for a month. And it came off in my hand, and the pot went sideways, and I caught it before it fell, but not before half the coffee went down my boot. I stood there with a coffee pot in one hand and a handle in the other and a wet boot, and Vera looked up from the ledger, and she looked at me, and then she looked at the handle in my hand, and then she looked back at my face, and then, quietly, without warning, without any preamble, she laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that comes out before a person can decide whether it's appropriate, that has some actual delight in it and doesn't apologize for being there. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then she got it back under control and said, very seriously, "I'll fix the handle tomorrow," and went back to the ledger. I stood there for a moment, longer than I needed to. Then I put the handle down on the counter and poured what was left of the coffee into my cup and sat back down. I didn't say anything, but I noticed something had happened that I didn't have a category for, and I set it aside in the place where I put things I wasn't ready to look at yet, and I went back to the assessor's letter, and after a while Vera closed the ledger and said good night and went to bed, and I sat by the stove for another hour thinking about the assessor's letter and not thinking about it at all. December came in hard. We lost 9 head in the first week. A section of fence on the North Range gave way in a storm, and they got out onto the open plateau before Dub caught it. We found 6 of them. The other 3 were just gone, the kind of gone that happens in that country in that kind of cold. I came back from the search on the 3rd day, and I was cold through to something below my bones, and I went into the house and sat down at the kitchen table without taking off my coat, and Vera set a plate of food in front of me without saying anything, and I ate it. When I was done, she set a cup of coffee in front of me, the handle fixed, I noticed, properly this time, with a new piece from the hardware in town, and sat down across from me. "How many?" she said. "3, I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "It's cattle," I said. "It happens." "I know it happens," she said. "I'm still sorry." I looked at her across the table. There was something in the way she'd said it, not softening it, not trying to make it feel smaller than it was, but also not making it dramatic. Just, "I know, and I'm sorry." The same plainness I'd recognized in the land office, turned in a different direction. "Thank you," I said. She nodded. She got up and cleared the plate, and I finished the coffee and went to bed, and that was all it was. But I lay there in the dark for a while thinking about the way she'd said it, and not quite being able to let it alone. January was the hardest month. A blizzard came in off the plateau on the 9th and lasted 4 days. We lost power to the well pump on the 2nd day, the mechanism froze, and the temperature inside the barn dropped to the point where I was genuinely worried about the horses. I spent most of the blizzard moving between the house and the barn, keeping the horses and the cattle that were penned close enough to the barn warmed and watered, and on the 3rd day, coming back from the barn in the dark, in wind that was doing its level best to knock me down. I missed the step at the back porch, which had iced over and went down hard. I knew immediately something was wrong with my right shoulder. Not broken, I'd broken things before and knew the difference, but badly wrenched, badly enough that getting up off the porch took longer than it should have and hurt in a way that left white spots in my vision. I got inside. I sat down at the kitchen table. I sat there for a moment trying to assess whether I could get back out to the barn with a shoulder that didn't want to lift past horizontal, and I was still running that calculation when Vera came out of the back hallway in her coat with a lantern. She stopped when she saw me. She looked at my face, which I imagined told her what she needed to know, and then she said, "What happened?" Not a question. The kind of sentence that already knows the general answer and is asking for the specifics. I told her. She set the lantern down. She came around the table and put her hands on my shoulder matter-of-factly, the way she did everything, and I had enough warning to brace for it, which was useful because the assessment hurt. "It's not broken," she said. "I know it's not broken. You need to keep it still for at least a week. I need to get back out to the barn." "Dub is in the barn," she said. "I sent him out 20 minutes ago when the wind changed, and I thought you'd been out there too long." She straightened up and moved to the stove. "The horses are his responsibility for tonight. Sit there." I sat there. She made a compress and bound the shoulder, and told me to take the medicine she put in front of me. And I took it because arguing with her in that register was like arguing with whether technically possible, practically pointless. Then she sat down across from me again, in the same chair as the night of the storm, and we sat in the kitchen with the blizzard going on outside and the stove going steadily, and after a while she said, "Tell me about the ranch, before, when you first came here." I looked at her. "Why?" "Because we've been in this house for 2 months," she said, "and I know how you take your coffee and what the ledgers looked like before I fixed them, and the fact that you fix things immediately except for coffee pot handles, which apparently you let go indefinitely. But I don't know anything about the place." I considered that for a moment, then I told her. I told her about coming to the Delaware River country in 1870, after I left the army, because a man I'd scouted with for 3 years had a sister who was selling 40 acres at the south end of what was now Morrow's Reach, and I'd ridden out to look at it. And I'd stood on the ridge at the north end of that 40 acres, and looked out at the plateau and the river valley below it, and something in me that had been clenched up for years had just loosened. The way things loosen when you find the place that fits. I told her about building the first section of the house with Dub and 2 other men, the summer of 1870. About buying the first cattle in the fall of that year, 40 head, and losing 11 of them to a dry winter. About a leaner coming out from her family in the east in the spring of 1871, and what it had been like to bring her up to the ridge and watch her look out at the valley, and what she'd said. I stopped there. Vera didn't push it. She just sat there in the way she sat, not filling the silence, not redirecting around it, just letting it be what it was. After a while I said, "She said it looked like something that had been waiting for someone to find it." Vera was quiet for a moment. "She was right," she said. I looked at her. "About the land," she said, "it does." I nodded. We sat there for a while longer, the blizzard going on outside, the stove keeping us warm, and at some point the silence between us shifted into something that was no longer the silence of 2 strangers being careful but something else entirely, and I recognized it and it scared me some, and I didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. And eventually she got up and said good night, and I sat there for another hour with my shoulder aching and my mind somewhere it hadn't been in a long time. The blizzard broke on the 11th. We'd lost 2 horses, one of the older mares and a gelding that had been in poor health going into the winter. I grieved them the way you grieve working animals you've known for years, quietly and without a lot of ceremony, out at the barn before anyone else was up. Vera came out while I was there. She didn't say anything. She stood beside me for a minute and then she went and checked on the other horses and came back and said, "The bay is favoring her left front. I'll ask Dub to look at her this morning." "Thank you," I said. She nodded and went back to the house, and I stood there for another minute and then I followed her in, and we had breakfast, and the work of the ranch went on. But something had changed. I knew it and I didn't know what to do with it, and so I did what I always did with things I didn't know what to do with. I worked. I fixed the well pump mechanism. I rebuilt the section of fence on the north range that had given way. I went over the feed calculations for the rest of the winter with Dub and adjusted the rotation. I did all of it with my right shoulder still complaining and with a part of my mind that wasn't on any of it, and Dub watched me for about a week, and then one morning at the barn he said, "You all right?" "Fine," I said. "You've checked that gate hinge 4 times this morning." "It's stiff." "It was stiff before Christmas." I put down the tool I was holding. "What are you getting at, Dub?" He looked at me with the patient expression of a man who has worked for the same person for 9 years and knows exactly what he's getting at, and also knows the exact limit of how far to push it. "Nothing," he said. "Gate hinge looks fine now," and he went back to what he was doing. February came in milder. The worst of the winter had broken, the way it sometimes does in that country, and the days started coming in with a little more light. The cold still real, but no longer the kind that makes you doubt whether spring is a thing that actually happens. I had a conversation with Vera in early February that I've thought about many times since. We were at the kitchen table after supper. This had become a kind of habit, without either of us having arranged it. Petties cleared and went to the cookhouse, and we stayed with our coffee and talked about the ranch, or about her farm, or about whatever the day had brought up. It was the most talking I'd done with another person, consistently, in 7 years, and I was aware of this without being sure what to do about it. She had been telling me about her farm, the East 40, which had a spring-fed water source she'd been trying to improve for 3 years before her husband's illness took precedence. She had a plan for it, a practical one, involving a stone channel that would feed into a holding pool and keep the water clean through summer. She described it precisely, with the kind of specificity that told me she'd been thinking it through for a long time, and I found myself listening to it in a way that was not polite interest but actual interest, the kind where you start thinking along with what the person is saying rather than simply waiting for your turn. "That would work," I said when she finished. "The stone channel approach. If you angle it 10 degrees east of where you're thinking, you'd catch the runoff from the ridge above it in a wet spring." She looked at me. "You know that ridge?" "I rode the East Dellard country before I settled here," I said. "That ridge drains northeast when the snowmelt is heavy." She was quiet for a moment. Then she took out the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. I'd noticed this habit before, the notebook, and wrote something in it. "Thank you," she said. "It's just a thought," I said. "It's a good thought," she said. She looked at what she'd written for a moment, then closed the notebook. Then she looked at me with the direct look I'd come to recognize, the one that meant she was going to say something plain, and had decided to go ahead and say it. "Morrow," she said. "Cal," I said. She paused. It was the first time I'd told her to use my given name. We'd been calling each other by last name since the land office, and I'd let it go on because I hadn't known how to change it without making something out of it. "Cal," she said, in the careful way of someone testing the weight of a word, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "The year is half done in March," she said. "The land grant requirement will be satisfied. You'll have your settlement." "Yes." "I want to ask you what you're thinking about after," she said. "Not to push anything. I think we should talk about it before we get there, rather than after." I looked at my coffee cup. I'd known this conversation was coming. I'd been knowing it for weeks in the same way you know a cold front is coming, not seeing it yet, but feeling it in the way the air sits. "What are you thinking about after?" I said. She looked at me steadily. "I asked you first." I was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the February evening was settling dark and clear, the stars coming out sharp and cold above the plateau. "I'm thinking," I said slowly, "that the arrangement has been not what I expected." "In what way?" "In most ways," I said. She waited. "I thought it would be orderly," I said. "Two people in a house with a clear agreement and defined boundaries and a known endpoint. And it has been orderly. You're the most orderly person I've ever shared a house with, which I mean as a serious compliment. The corner of her mouth moved. Thank you. But it hasn't stayed. I stopped, started again. I thought the boundaries would hold the shape of the thing, I said. I didn't account for the fact that when two people live alongside each other honestly, the shape changes. Vera looked at me for a long moment. Yes, she said, it does. We sat with that for a beat. I'm not going to tell you what I want, I said, because I don't think that's the right order of things. You came into this arrangement with terms that protected you, and I'd like those terms to stay in force until you've had a chance to say what you think. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her own coffee cup. Then she said, I came into this arrangement because my farm was failing and the winter was coming and I needed, not a rescue. I want to be clear about that. I needed a practical solution, and this was a practical solution, and I'm not given to romanticizing practical solutions. I know, I said. But, she said, and then she was quiet for a moment in the way she went quiet when she was choosing her words with care, rather than just saying the first thing that occurred to her. But I'll tell you that when I sat down in that land office and asked you 6 questions and 1 extra, I was looking for a man who would deal honestly with me. That was what I needed more than anything, just honest dealing. Yes, I said. And you have been that, she said. You have been considerably more than that, in fact, which I did not anticipate. She looked up at me. I'm not sure what to do with considerably more than I anticipated. I looked at her across the kitchen table, in the light of the lamp Vera had brought from her farm and set on the table because the one that had been there before wasn't bright enough for the ledger work. And I thought about a woman who had come to a business meeting with 6 questions and her farm deed under her arm, and who had spent the winter fixing coffee pot handles and reorganizing ledgers, and sitting with me in the dark, while a blizzard went on outside without either of us saying too much. And I thought, I have been a fool to think this was ever going to stay inside the lines I drew around it. Then don't do anything with it yet, I said. Just let it be what it is for a while, and we'll see where it gets us. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, That is the most sensible thing you've said since October. I said, I've said a lot of sensible things since October. And she laughed, the same real laugh as the coffee pot evening, no apology in it. And I sat across from her and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was still clenched. And outside the window the February stars were hard and bright above the plateau, and the ranch was quiet. And that was the night I knew. March came in green. Not all at once. That country doesn't give you all at once. It gives you a little at a time, as if it's checking to see whether you can be trusted with it. But the snow came off the south-facing slopes first, the way it always does, and the grass came up pale and then deepened, and the cattle that had wintered on the supplemental feed started working the greening range with the particular energy of animals that have been patient long enough. I was out at the north fence line on a morning in the 3rd week of March, repairing a section that the blizzard had damaged back in January, and I hadn't gotten to yet, when I looked up and saw Vera coming across the range on the gray horse she'd brought from her farm. She rode well. I'd noticed this from the first week, but hadn't said anything because it wasn't the kind of thing you said in an arrangement. And she came up to the fence line and swung down and tied the gray to a post and stood looking out at the range with her hands in her coat pockets. I went back to the fence for a minute. Then I said, You rode out here for a reason. I came to see the North Range, she said. I haven't seen it in good light. You came out in the cold to see the North Range. It's not that cold, she said. I let that go. We stood there for a while, both of us looking out at the range and the plateau beyond it, and the mountains that you could see on a clear day, which this was. The land grant year runs out at the end of the month, she said. I know. The county office will want the paperwork. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what I said in February, she said, about not knowing what to do with considerably more than I anticipated. "All right," I said. "I've figured it out," she said. I looked at her. She was looking out at the range still, her profile to me, and she said, "I'm going to stay." I was quiet. "Not because of the arrangement," she said. "The arrangement is done at the end of the month. I'm going to stay because," she paused, "because I have not slept this well in 4 years. Because I know where the ledgers are and how the cattle rotation works and where the horses are stabled and which porch step ices over. And I know that when there's a blizzard and I tell the foreman to go out to the barn, someone has already been thinking about the horses. And because," she stopped again. "Because," I said. She turned and looked at me directly, the way she'd looked at me across the table in the land office with her farm deed and her 6 questions, except that the expression was different now, not professional, not careful, just completely honest. "Because you asked me what I wanted before you said what you wanted," she said, "and I am not going to waste a man like that." I looked at her for a long moment. The North Range stretched out behind her, going green in the March light, and the gray horse shifted and blew, and somewhere down the fence line, a meadowlark was making its argument for the season. "I wasn't going to let the arrangement end," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I was going to ask you to consider making it permanent. I've been trying to figure out how to say it without it sounding like a business proposition." "How were you planning to say it?" "I hadn't figured that out yet," I said. "It's why I've been repairing the same section of fence for 45 minutes. She looked at the fence, then she looked back at me. "Well," she said, "I've saved you the trouble." "You have," I said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something was settled. Then she untied the gray and swung up and said, "Come back to the house when you're done. Petty's is making the stew you like." She rode back across the range in the March morning, straight-backed and easy in the saddle, and I stood there with my fence tools and watched her go and thought, 7 years of fine. And then one November I rode into Cutter's Fork to post a notice because I had a deadline, and a woman walked in with her farm deed and 6 questions and changed the whole equation without either of us planning it. We sent the paperwork to the county land office in April. The grant was confirmed. The land, all of it, my 4,200 acres and her 400 east of the Dellard, was logged as Morrow's Reach in both their names, which was Vera's idea and which I thought was the right one. She built the stone water channel on her East 40 that summer. I helped. Dub helped. The angle we'd talked about in February turned out to be exactly right, and the first wet week of May confirmed it, the water running clean and steady into the holding pool she'd designed. She stood at the edge of it one evening with her boots muddy to the ankle and her hands on her hips, looking at the water, and I stood beside her and thought about the woman who had come to a business meeting and read the terms of a contract before she agreed to anything, and about the same woman binding my shoulder in the dark while a blizzard went on, and about the laugh that had come out before she could decide whether it was appropriate. "Well," she said, looking at the pool, "that'll do." "It'll do," I agreed. She looked at me sideways. "You're pleased with yourself about the angle." "I told you the angle." "You told me," she said. "I acknowledged it. You still don't need to be pleased about it." "I'm going to be a little pleased about it," I said. She made a sound that was almost the laugh and then got it back and said we should get back before dark, and we went back, and the summer went on, and the ranch was what it had always been, the cattle and the range and the work and the seasons coming and going, except that it wasn't what it had always been at all. It was something I hadn't had words for, all those years of fine. It was a house with someone in it. It was coffee made for 2 people and ledgers that balanced and a laugh in the kitchen when something went sideways, and a woman who rode straight-backed across the North Range in the March light like she was born to be in that country. Dub asked me once, late that summer, whether I'd have done it differently, come to Cutter's Fork sooner, or handled the first months differently, or found some better way into the thing than a notice posted in a land office because the county had a deadline. I thought about it for a while, then I said no. He looked at me. She came to that land office because she had her own reasons and her own terms, I said. If I'd shown up at her farm in September with my hat in my hand and a speech prepared, she'd have sent me home. She needed to come to it the way she came to everything, clear-eyed with questions on her own terms. I looked out at the range. The deadline was the right door. I just didn't know it at the time. Dub considered that. So the county did you a favor, he said. The county did me a favor, I said. Don't tell them that. He went back to work. I went back to work. And somewhere across the ranch in the East 40 above the Dellard River, water was running clean and steady through a stone channel at exactly the right angle, filling a pool that would hold through the driest summer, which was more than most things managed. I thought that about covered it.